सर मैं वेलकम करती हूँ आपको जामिया के इस कार्यक्रम में। और इसके अंदर सभी मेहमान होकर बैठे हुए हैं, आपका इंतजार था। एंड आई वाज एक्सट्रीमली ग्रेटफुल कि आपने इतना टाइम निकाला। आप इतने बिजी हैं इस वक्त, और आपके आशीर्वाद के बिना हम आगे नहीं चल सकते थे, ये बहुत जरूरी था। जामिया और गांधी जी का बहुत क्लोज संबंध है। बहुत जमाने में जामिया बना था, और जिन जिन हालात में बना था उसमें ये गांधी जी के डायरेक्शंस के ऊपर ही, उनके कहे के ऊपर जो कुछ वो कहते थे ऐसा ही यहाँ करते थे लोग, और उसके ऊपर ये ना बना। बेसिक एजुकेशन गांधी जी का पहली बार यही इनिशिएट हुआ हमारे डिपार्टमेंट ऑफ एजुकेशन में, और उससे पहले कहीं पे वो एक सब्जेक्ट की तरह नहीं था। और गांधी जी के ने यहाँ तक भी कहा है कि अगर इस जरूरत पड़ी, जामिया के पैसे की प्रॉब्लम शुरू में रहती ही है, तो मैं इसके लिए प्याला लेके निकल सकता हूँ। तो इतना बड़ा बलिदान करने को तैयार थे वो जामिया के लिए। और इसके लिए जामिया आज हर मौके पे, हर जगह उनके जो डायरेक्शन है उसको फॉलो करता है, और उनसे सीखने की कोशिश करता है। इसलिए सेमिनार जो डिफरेंट हो रहे हैं, वेबिनार जो हो रहे हैं, उनमें पहला आपकी प्रेजेंस में मिली है। आपके उसकी वजह से हम आगे भी बहुत कुछ कर पाएंगे। मैं रिक्वेस्ट करूंगी आपसे सर कि आप अपना उद्बोधन दें और हम लोग को गाइड करें कि हम आगे के कार्यक्रम भी कैसे करेंगे। इस वक्त मैं जानती हूँ आप न्यू एजुकेशन, नेशनल एजुकेशन पॉलिसी में बहुत बिजी हैं, और वही है जो इस देश को एक डिफरेंट डायरेक्शन में ले जाएगा। और हाँ, जामिया और बाकी यूनिवर्सिटी सब आपके साथ हैं, बट मैं इस वक्त जामिया के लिए ही कह सकती हूँ। हमारे जितने भी साथी यहाँ बैठे हैं और जो नहीं बैठे हैं, सब आपके साथ हैं इस एजुकेशन पॉलिसी को सफल बनाने में, इसको अच्छी तरह से इसका क्रियान्वयन करने में, और डायरेक्शंस जिस तरह हम लोग को मिलते रहेंगे इसको करने के, क्योंकि वो हमारे लिए भी, एक एक आदमी के लिए, देशवासी के लिए फायदे की। आगे अगर आगे बढ़ना है देश को, तो इसको अच्छी तरह इम्प्लीमेंट ही करना होगा, और इसमें भी हम गांधी जी के सिद्धांतों के ऊपर ही चलेंगे। जब तक आदमी मेहनत नहीं करेगा वो पहुंचेगा नहीं, और मगर एंड तक जरूर पहुंच सकता है, ऐसा उन्होंने कहा है। सर मैं आपसे रिक्वेस्ट करती हूँ कि आप हम लोग को एड्रेस कर दें।
धन्यवाद नजमा जी। आज हमारे साथ क्योंकि जामिया मिलिया इस्लामिया के साथ ऑक्सफोर्ड विश्वविद्यालय के फैसल देव जी भी जुड़े हुए हैं, और रविंद्र कुमार गांधीवादी विचारों के प्रखर वक्ता और चिंतक हमारे साथ जुड़े हुए हैं। बहुत सारे लोग हमारे साथ जुड़े हैं नजमा जी, और मुझे लगता है कि जो गांधी 150 का पूरे देश में नहीं पूरी दुनिया में जो बनाया जा रहा है, उस कड़ी में जामिया ने इसको किया है। मैं जामिया को बहुत बधाई देना चाहता हूं। आपके नेतृत्व में गांधी जी ने जिस संस्था की स्थापना की, उन गांधी जी के विचारों का ध्वजवाहक बनकर के जामिया बहुत तेजी से आगे बढ़ रहा है, इस बात की मुझे खुशी है। और जामिया 1920 से और आज 2020 हो गया, इस लंबी 100 साल के सफर में जामिया ने जो उतार और चढ़ाव देखे होंगे, और जिन विचारों को लेकर के गांधी जी ने इस जामिया की स्थापना की होगी, जिन विषम और विपरीत परिस्थितियों में गांधी जी ने इस जामिया को जन्म दिया होगा, वो जामिया से जुड़े हर छात्र छात्रा के लिए एक पाथेय बनेगा, उसके लक्ष्य शिखर तक पहुंचने के लिए प्रेरक मार्ग बनेगा। मैं ये समझता हूं कि गांधी 150 पूरी दुनिया को जरूरत है। आज गांधी के विचार और दर्शन की पूरी दुनिया महसूस कर रही है कि गांधी के वो जो विचार थे, उनके जो सत्य है, अहिंसा है, प्रेम है, जो सौहार्दता है, और जो विनम्रता है, जो जीवन के प्रति, मूल्यों के प्रति उनकी प्रतिबद्धता है, उसको आज पूरी दुनिया को जरूरत है। क्योंकि मैं ये समझता हूं, जब भी दुनिया के लोग कराहट से गुजरते हैं, तब गांधी उनको याद आते हैं। मैं 150 गांधी और 150 गांधी विचार और उनके दर्शन पर जो ये वेबिनार हो रहा है, इससे जुड़े सभी लोगों का मुझे अभिनंदन करना है और मुझे आग्रह करना है। मुझे ये आग्रह करना है कि यदि ये देश भारत, जिसमें गांधी ने जन्म लेकर के उस भारत की संस्कृति को अपनी आत्मा में बसा करके जो पूरे विश्व को अपना परिवार, अयम निजः परोवेति गणना लघु चेतसा मुरारी चेतनम वसुधैव कुटुंबकम, पूरी दुनिया को अपना परिवार मानने वाला गांधी का वो चिंतन, वो बंधन, और उस परिवार को भी यूं ही केवल मानने वाला नहीं, बल्कि उसके लिए सर्वे भवन्तु सुखिनः सर्वे सन्तु निरामय की कल्पना करने वाला, कि जब तक मनुष्य धरती पर कोई भी प्राणी दुखी है, हम सुख का एहसास नहीं कर सकते हैं, लेकिन हाँ, उस सुख का एहसास करने के लिए, दुनिया के कष्टों को दूर करने के लिए, अपनी स्वाभिमानी जीवन को स्वाभिमान के साथ आगे बढ़ाने के लिए जो रास्ते थे उनके, वो बहुत मजबूत रास्ते थे। मैं समझता हूँ टिकट टिप्पणी करने वाले लोग तो पूरी दुनिया में बिखरे हैं, आलोचना तो कोई भी कर सकता है, लेकिन उस मार्ग पर चल के उसका रिजल्ट दिखाने वाले लोगों का कम ही दम होता है। और आज पूरी दुनिया गांधी के पीछे खड़ी है। गांधी सत्य, प्रेम, अहिंसा, उन्होंने हमेशा कहा कि सत्य तो सत्य है, सत्य तो सत्य है, वो भले ही विलंब हो जाएगा, लेकिन सत्य को कोई नकार नहीं सकता। वो सत्य एक ऐसा मार्ग है जो अंततोगत्वा आपको कहीं भटकने नहीं देगा। सत्य की नींव पर खड़ा कोई विचार, सत्य की नींव पर खड़ा कोई व्यक्ति, सत्य की नींव पर खड़ा कोई परिवार, कोई समाज, कोई राष्ट्र कभी अपमानित नहीं हो सकता, और जो उसको अपमानित करता है उसको भविष्य में अपमान का सामना स्वयं करना पड़ता है। इसलिए वो बहुत ताकत के साथ दृढ़तावादी थे सत्य को लेकर के। सत्य के पीछे विश्लेषण आप पूरा कर दीजिए, हजारों घंटों की चर्चा हो सकती है, लेकिन जो उनका सत्य था, जो उनकी दृढ़ता थी, जो उन्होंने सत्य के पीछे जो उनका मानस था, जिस सत्य की उन्होंने बात की, जीवन जीने का सबसे सशक्त रास्ता उन्होंने कहा, बुराई ज्यादा दिनों तक नहीं जी सकती, बुराई की लंबी आयु नहीं होती, सच्चाई की ही जीत होती है। छल कपट से बढ़ने वाला व्यक्ति, छल कपट से बढ़ने वाला परिवार, छल कपट से बढ़ने वाला समाज और राष्ट्र अधिक दिनों का जिंदा नहीं रहता, खड़ा नहीं रहता, और ना उसको कोई याद करता है। ये जो असतोमा सद्गमय की बात की उन्होंने, ये जो मृत्योर्मा अमृतम गमय की बात की, ये तमसोमा ज्योतिर्गमय, अंधकार को चीर करके हम रोशनी जरूर देंगे, लेकिन अंधकार को चीरने की हर व्यक्ति की अपनी अपनी दिशा होगी, तर्क होगा, रास्ता होगा। जो उनका रास्ता था, यदि उस पर आज की परिस्थितियों में भी विचार किया जाए तो सशक्त रास्ता था उनका, जहां उन्होंने अहिंसा की बात की। आज क्या पूरी दुनिया ये महसूस नहीं कर रही है उस गांधी की अहिंसा? ये हिंसा तो कभी किसी को खड़ा कर ही नहीं सकती है। हिंसा में विचार नहीं हो सकता, व्यवहार नहीं हो सकता, आचार नहीं हो सकता, संवेदनाएं नहीं हो सकती, जीवन नहीं हो सकता। वो कुछ क्षणों के लिए जो हिंसा का भाव होता है, वो केवल सत्ता को प्राप्त करने के लिए, वो सत्ता चाहे विचारों की जबरदस्ती हो, और चाहे सत्ता राजनीतिक हो, चाहे सत्ता सामाजिक हो, ये जबरदस्ती की हिंसा करने वाले लोग, हिंसा केवल शारीरिक हिंसा नहीं है, विचारों की भी हिंसा है। आप किसी के प्रति यदि बुरा भाव देख रहे हैं, बुरा भाव है किसी के प्रति, आपकी भावना ठीक नहीं, वो भी हिंसा है। इसलिए गांधी जी की जो अहिंसा थी, वो अपने आप में बहुत अद्भुत अहिंसा थी। मैं देखता हूं, दुनिया के लोगों को पढ़ता हूं, मैं तमाम ऐसे तर्क कुतर्क देने की, कुछ लोग जिनका मानस है केवल खराब बोलना ही है, विश्लेषण चीरफाड़ करना ही है, लेकिन आज महसूस कर रहे हैं, उनको भी लोग महसूस कर रहे हैं कि नहीं, आज जरूरत गांधी के उस अहिंसा की है। गांधी व्यक्ति नहीं है, गांधी तो विचार है। ये अहिंसा गांधी नहीं है, अहिंसा विचार है, व्यक्ति है। व्यक्ति के अंदर जो विचार है, ये जीवन पद्धति, वो गांधी का दर्शन है। हम उस दर्शन को जीते हैं। हम व्यक्ति की कमियों पर कभी, हिंदुस्तान ने व्यक्ति की कमियों पर जोर न देकर, हर व्यक्ति की जो उसकी उपलब्धियां हैं, जो उसके अंदर गुण हैं, उन गुणों को लेने की हमने हमेशा कोशिश की। अवगुणों की चर्चा नहीं की, क्योंकि हमारा हमेशा ये विचार रहा है कि किसी के गुणों की चर्चा करने से गुण बढ़ते हैं, और किसी के अवगुणों की चर्चा करने से अवगुण बढ़ते हैं। ये फिलॉसफी हमारे दर्शन में भी रही, हिंदुस्तान के दर्शन में भी रही है। और इसलिए मैं ये समझता हूँ जो गांधी के प्रति जो उन्होंने हमेशा कहा है कि बुरी भावना भी हिंसा है, बिना किसी को दुख पहुंचाए अपने लक्ष्य को प्राप्त करना ही अहिंसा है। जबरन हिंसा से प्राप्त करने वाला धन, साम्राज्य और सुख सुविधा वो इंसान को पनपने देती, समाज को पनपने नहीं देती। और इसलिए समाज में समरसता का जो उनका रास्ता था वो आज की परिस्थितियों में बहुत जरूरी है। लोग महसूस कर रहे हैं जबकि पूरी दुनिया हिंसा की चपेट में आती है, जब तक तो कोई सुरक्षित है तब तक उसको गांधी याद नहीं आते हैं, लेकिन जब चोट पड़ती है तब महसूस होती है कि अहिंसा में ज्यादा ताकत है। हिंसा का रास्ता कोई प्रबल रास्ता नहीं हो सकता। अहिंसा का रास्ता, अहिंसा में भी ताकत है। अहिंसा जो ये कहते हैं कि नहीं नहीं आप पिटते रहिए और दूसरे, ये वसूल नहीं था गांधी जी का। गांधी जी में दृढ़ता थी, गांधी को समझने की जरूरत है, उनके विचार को जानने की जरूरत है, उनमें दृढ़ता थी। यदि अहिंसा की भी बात करते थे तो उनकी अहिंसा आप समझ सकते हैं कि किस सीमा तक की अहिंसा थी, दृढ़ता वाली अहिंसा थी। जब तक वो किसी को हरा नहीं देंगे तब तक वो अपने मार्ग से अडिग नहीं हो सकते, इस सीमा तक की दृढ़ता थी। और इसलिए मैं समझता हूं आज की परिस्थितियों में चाहे उनका सत्य है, चाहे अहिंसा है और चाहे प्रेम है, आज कहाँ चला गया प्रेम? यदि ये प्रेम रहता पूरी दुनिया में, अरे हमने तो हमेशा से ये कहा है हम विश्व बंधुत्व के लोग हैं। हमने तो कहा है ये जो माता भूमि पुत्रों पृथिव्या, ये थी संस्कृति उनके अंदर। ये पूरी धरती को हमने माँ कहा है, जिसकी कोख से पैदा होने वाला हर प्राणी अपना एक अंग है। जब हर प्राणी को कोई व्यक्ति अंग मानेगा, अपना परिवार मानेगा, तो वहां हिंसा का कोई स्थान नहीं होता है, वहां साम्राज्यवादिता का कोई स्थान नहीं होता है, वहां पीड़ा और दुख और दर्द देने का कोई स्थान नहीं होता है। ये जो उनका प्रेम था, सौहार्दता थी, जो समरसता थी, उनका प्रेम आज भी दुनिया को ये महसूस हो सकता है कि नहीं, जो उनकी समरसता थी, जो उनकी सहजता थी, जो उनका सौहार्दता का था, ये बहुत जरूरी है। सामाजिक समरसता की उनकी बहुत सरल तरीके से भाषण दे करके नहीं, बड़ी बड़ी चर्चा और चिंता करके नहीं, बल्कि अपने जीवन को सहज तरीके से प्रस्तुत करना, ऊंच नीच के भाव को खत्म करना, जिस तरीके से उन्होंने किया है वो दुर्लभ है। मैं सोचता हूँ उन दर्शन को उठाने की आज जरूरत है। मैं पीछे के दिनों में यूनेस्को में था, दुनिया के देश इस बात को लेकर के चिंतित थे कि हाँ, गांधी के उस चिंतन की, उन दर्शन की आज पूरी दुनिया की मानवता को जरूरत है। और मैंने कहा था कि पूरी दुनिया को, यूनेस्को को भी इस गांधी 150 को पूरी दुनिया में मनाना चाहिए। कुछ तो चर्चा करके अपने मन के अंदर ऊर्जा आएगी, उन विचारों को, उस दर्शन को अपने में समाहित करके, अच्छाई को ग्रहण करके और आगे बढ़ने का जो ललक है, जो प्रेरणा है, वो गांधी 150 की श्रृंखला में आज जामिया कर रहे हैं। मुझे लगता है जामिया को हर हालत में गांधी जी को हमेशा न केवल याद रखना चाहिए, बल्कि जामिया याद भी रखता है। और जामिया उनके दर्शन पर, उनके चिंतन पर, उनकी मेहनत पर, उनके विचार पर, उनकी दृष्टिकोण पर, उनके विजन पर, उनके मिशन पर आज खड़ा। मुझे खुशी होती है जब मैं जामिया का जब मैं यहाँ की कुलपति नजमा अख्तर जी से कल बात कर रहा था, तो मुझे खुशी होती है कि हमारे जामिया के बच्चे हर क्षेत्र में बहुत आगे निकल रहे हैं, चाहे वो प्रशासनिक क्षेत्र हो, चाहे वो पीछे के दिनों में हमने हॉकाथॉन किया था, मेरी जामिया के बच्चे बहुत अच्छे स्थान पर आए। मैं पीछे से लगातार मेरी जामिया की समीक्षा कर रहा हूँ। मुझे खुशी होती है कि जामिया बहुत अच्छे तरीके से आगे बढ़ रहा है। जामिया को बदनाम करने वाले कुछ लोग हो सकते हैं, लेकिन जामिया उनको भी बेनकाब करेगा। जामिया निश्चित एक ताकत के साथ हिंदुस्तान को उभरते, हिंदुस्तान नए भारत, जो मेरे देश के प्रधानमंत्री ने कहा, ऐसा भारत जो स्वच्छ भारत होगा, जो स्वस्थ भारत होगा, जो सक्षम भारत होगा, जो सफल भारत हो, जो श्रेष्ठ भारत होगा, जो आत्मनिर्भर भारत होगा, ऐसे श्रेष्ठ भारत की दिशा में मेरा जामिया मील का पत्थर बनकर के आगे आएगा। और अब तो जो हमने नई शिक्षा नीति को लेकर के हम आए हैं, ये नई शिक्षा नीति भले ही 34-35 वर्षों में आई होगी, लेकिन ये देश की आजादी के बाद ये भारत की पहली ऐसी शिक्षा नीति है जो मूल्य आधारित, मूल्यों के आधार पर, शिला पर खड़े होकर के ज्ञान, विज्ञान, अनुसंधान, नवाचार, प्रौद्योगिकी को लेकर के विश्व की स्पर्धा पर जाएगा। गांधी जी को ने जो नई तालीम दी हमको, हमने इस नई शिक्षा नीति में उसको जोड़ा है। गांधी जी ने हमेशा कहा अपनी जो प्रारंभिक जो शिक्षा है वो अपनी मातृभाषा में होना चाहिए। जो बच्चे के मन के अंदर के उद्गार हैं, जिस भाषा में वो जन्मता है, बोलता है, उस भाषा में वो ज्यादा अभिव्यक्ति करता है। हम इस समय लेके आए हैं शिक्षा नीति में गांधी जी को, उनके उस विजन को कि हाँ मातृभाषा में प्रारंभिक शिक्षा होनी चाहिए। वैसे तो पूरी दुनिया की भाषाओं को सीखना है हमको हर भाषा को सीखना है, लेकिन पहली प्राथमिकता हमारे हिंदुस्तान की जो अनुसूची 8 में 22 भारतीय भाषाएं हैं उनको सशक्त करने का है। वो मेरी तमिल हो सकती है, तेलुगु हो सकती है, मलयालम, कन्नड़, गुजराती, मराठी, बंगाली, उर्दू, पंजाबी, हिंदी, संस्कृत, ये जितने भी मेरी भाषाएं हैं भारत के संविधान के अनुसूची 8 में, इनको सशक्त और मजबूत करने का है। और इसलिए हमने कहा है जो प्रारंभिक शिक्षा होगी मेरी वो मातृभाषा में होगी। कोई राज्य चाहिए तो उच्च शिक्षा तक भी वो अपनी मातृभाषा में कर सकता है। गांधी जी ने कहा था कि शिक्षा सार्वभौमिक होनी चाहिए, और हम इस शिक्षा में सार्वभौमिकता को पूरी ताकत के साथ लाए हैं। उन्होंने मानवीय मूल्यों का विकास पर हमेशा जोर दिया। पूरी दुनिया यदि मानवीय मूल्य ही रास हो गए तो ये तो व्यक्ति पत्थर बन जाएगा। असली तो उसकी संवेदना को बचाने का है, उसके मानवीय मूल्यों को बचाने का है। और इस विश्व में यदि इस देश ने लीडरशिप दी है तो मानवीय मूल्यों के आधार पर ज्ञान, विज्ञान, अनुसंधान और क्षेत्र की दिशा में प्रगति के अवसरों को बढ़ाते हुए पूरी दुनिया का भी मार्गदर्शन किया है। मैं समझता हूँ गांधी जी ने कहा कि उपयोगी, जिम्मेदार और गतिशील नागरिक का निर्माण होना चाहिए। उपयोगी हो, जिम्मेदार हो और गतिशील हो, उसमें स्फूर्ति हो, गतिशीलता हो, स्वतः स्फूर्तता हो। ये उन्होंने जिस बात को कहा है सूत्र रूप में कहा है, लेकिन इसके पीछे बहुत बड़ा विजन छिपा हुआ है। उन्होंने कहा कि शिक्षा द्वारा बच्चे की सभी छिपी हुई शक्तियों का विकास होना चाहिए। अभी छोटी बात नहीं है, बच्चे में छिपी हुई सभी शक्ति का विकास होना चाहिए। हमारे वैज्ञानिकों ने कहा है और विशेषज्ञों ने कहा है कि हमारी कमेटी ने भी जो कस्तूरी रंगन जी की अध्यक्षता में नई शिक्षा नीति की कमेटी थी, उसने भी इस बात को अपनी संशोधित की 3 वर्ष से और 6 वर्ष तक के बच्चे का जो मानसिक विकास होता है वो 85% तक होता है। इसका मतलब यह है कि वो 3 से 6 वर्ष का बच्चा हमारे लिए ऐसी पूंजी है, जब उसको हम उस लाइन पर किस तरीके से, सहज तरीके से, किस भाव से उसकी उन मस्तिष्क के विकास पूरी ताकत के साथ कर सकते हैं। और इसलिए गांधी जी ने भी गांधी जी बहुत पारखी थे। यदि आप देखेंगे सामाजिक विज्ञान हो और चाहे वो वैज्ञानिक विश्लेषण हो, चाहे वो आध्यात्म का हो, गांधी जी का जो चिंतन और मंथन रहा है उसको समझ पाना किसी के बस का बात नहीं। जितना भी समझेगा वो और गहराई तक जाएगा, वो दर्शन है। और इसलिए मैं ये समझता हूँ कि यदि उन्होंने सामाजिक मूल्यों के आधार पर शिक्षा कही है, शरीर, मन और आत्मा के सामंजस्य पूर्ण विकास को प्राप्त करना वही शिक्षा है। शरीर, मन और आत्मा का संपूर्ण विकास करना ये शिक्षा है। तो मैं ये समझता हूं कि आज के संदर्भ में मुझे याद है कि उन्होंने अनासक्ति योग लिखा था जब वो हिमालय में गए थे। मुझे पीछे के दिनों में जब मैंने विवेकानंद जी को जानने की कोशिश की, उसके बाद मैंने अनासक्ति योग गांधी जी का जब पढ़ा, और वो वहाँ हिमालय में जाकर के उन्होंने जिस समय अनासक्ति योग को लिखा है, वो कोई अनासक्ति योग को भी जरूर मेरे छात्रों को पढ़ना चाहिए, क्योंकि उससे उनको ऊर्जा मिलेगी, उनको एक दिशा मिलेगी, एक दर्शन मिलेगा, और हर मुसीबत का सामना करने का, उनको मुकाबला करने का उनको जो जज्बा मिलेगा वो उनके वजन से मिलेगा। मैं आप सबके प्रति बहुत आभारी हूँ कि आपने आज ये शुरू किया है, और मुझे अच्छा लगता कि मैं सभी लोगों के बीच रहता और सबके सुनता, लेकिन व्यवस्था थी, कल भी मैंने आपको बताया संभव नहीं हो पा रहा था। लेकिन मुझे लगा कि गांधी जी ने जामिया की स्थापना की, और जामिया आज गांधी 150 शुरू कर रहे, मना रहे, तो ऐसे अवसर पर मैं अपने सभी छात्र छात्रों को, संकाय को और सभी प्रोफेसर गण को और इस जामिया परिवार को, जो सशक्त परिवार है मेरा, उस पूरी जामिया परिवार को मैं शुभकामना देता हूँ। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद और नमस्कार।
थैंक यू सर। आपका आना हमारे लिए बहुत शुभ है और हमें बहुत ही शक्ति दे रहा है कि हम इन गांधी 150 कार्यक्रम को बहुत तेजी से आगे ले जाएं और उसको अपने जामिया के लाइफ में, जो कि इस वक्त हमारा 100वां साल चल रहा है, इसमें पूरी तरह से इसका समन्वय करें और इससे बहुत कुछ सीखें। आपके डायरेक्शंस में हम लोग ये सब करते रहेंगे और पूरी उम्मीद करते हैं। हमारा सौभाग्य है कि हमारे पास आज एजुकेशन मिनिस्टर इस तरह के मिले हैं जिन्होंने जो बोल नहीं रहे हैं बल्कि कर चुके हैं, एज बीइंग द यंगेस्ट कैबिनेट मिनिस्टर ऑफ उत्तर प्रदेश। और उसके बाद जिस तरह से आप बढ़े हैं एजुकेशन चीफ मिनिस्टर एंड एवरीथिंग, और आज हमारे सामने हैं, तो ये हमारा सौभाग्य है कि आपके साथ हमें ये करने का, सब चीज करने का, और खासतौर से न्यू एजुकेशन पॉलिसी को लगाने का मौका मिलेगा। और आपका
बहुत धन्यवाद नंदा जी, और आप सभी लोगों का आभार।
धन्यवाद सर। मुकेश जी, आप लोग
Yes, I'll go ahead. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Mukesh Ranjan. I teach in the Department of English and carry an adjunct responsibility in university as an OSD Planning and Development. Jamia Millia Islamia has collaborated with the University of Oxford, UK for the first lecture in the webinar series on Gandhian Thought and Philosophy. This webinar series is in sync with the University Grants Commission's proposal to celebrate 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi to disseminate Gandhian thought and philosophy in intellectual circles. We have participants attending this webinar from our partner institutions based in Americas, Europe, West Asia, and Republic of Korea. The panelists here will comment on the contemporaneous relevance of Mahatma Gandhi and how he continues to inform our consciousness in terms of policy formulation and implementation. They would also be inclined to examine how Gandhi's cardinal principles of truth and nonviolence have played out and how these principles underpin his whole philosophy, a philosophy that viewed the universe as an organic whole. Today we are presenting a lecture titled The Geography of Nonviolence by Professor Faisal Devji, Department of History, University of Oxford. It is indeed our privilege to have him with us. We are extremely fortunate that Honorable Human Resource Minister Shri Ramesh Pokhriyal ji joined this webinar as the chief guest and gave the inaugural address. We are equally privileged to have Professor Ravindra Kumar, former Vice Chancellor of Merit University and a distinguished Gandhian Scholar, as a discussant. The webinar session would be chaired by Professor Najma Akhar, Vice Chancellor, Jamia Millia Islamia. Professor Akhtar is the first woman Vice Chancellor of this university that is celebrating its centenary year in 2020. I would remind the participants that if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in WebEx control panel. We will pass on the questions to the panelists as and when convenient to elicit their response. However, one would remain mindful of the structure of this webinar and the limits of time. Now, without further ado, I will request the esteemed Vice Chancellor, Jamia Millia Islamia, Professor Najma Akhtar, to give her welcome address and conduct the proceedings. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. The esteemed panelists and the guests from the University of Oxford, UK, MHRD, UGC, Jamia colleagues, and ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure indeed for me to welcome you all to the webinar on Gandhian's Thought and Philosophy, organized by Jamia Millia Islamia in collaboration with the University of Oxford, UK. I'm very happy and grateful that many distinguished scholars and teachers have come from both home and abroad to share their knowledge and experience and to explore how Gandhian thought and philosophy could be disseminated in intellectual circles to make them actionable for the betterment of the world. I'm extremely delighted that Honorable Human Resource Minister Shri Ramesh Pokhriyal Nishankji had readily agreed to participate in the webinar, and despite his very hectic schedule. And it was totally impossible today because of his suddenly, and the meetings which have come up suddenly, but he managed to take out some time for us, and this webinar has actually been given the right direction by his address in the morning. I'm deeply touched, as he is not only committed to the education processes in India, our minister is also cares and has special interest in Jamia affairs, and that is shown by his snatching away some minutes for us from his very important meetings today. It's also very heartening to have Professor Faisal Devji from the University of Oxford as the main speaker of this event, who would share perspectives on Gandhian principles of nonviolence, which have traveled across the globe and influenced races and eminent leaders, as already said by our minister. Professor Ravindra Kumar is the other eminent panelist who would enrich the discussions of his Gandhian with his Gandhian scholarship. I shall have the occasion to introduce each of them separately, but by the way of my opening remarks, I'd like to say that Gandhian thought and philosophy is as much relevant today, very relevant today also, as they were during Gandhiji's lifetime. With the passage of time, Gandhi's teaching got confined to textbooks. Today, we can see the conscious effort to bring some aspects of Gandhi out of the textbooks and integrate them with our daily life. Be it the issue of cleanliness rolled out under the aegis of Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, or the issue of self-reliance that is playing out as self-sufficient Atmanirbhar Bharat. There is a conscious effort in terms of policy making to seek universal upliftment of the masses and the downtrodden, who were very near to Gandhiji's heart. In real world, Gandhi worked tirelessly for India's freedom and to bring peace and harmony to India. For Gandhi, any positive change was to be brought about by ethical, non-violent, and democratic means. For him, means were as significant as the ends. There are very few countries in the world where something or the other is not being done, achieved, or organized in the name of Gandhiji. In short, there's a global non-violent awakening and awareness after Gandhi. The name of Mahatma Gandhi transcends the bounds of race, religion, nation states, and has emerged as the prophetic voice of the 21st century. Today, Gandhi is remembered for his passionate adherence to the practice of nonviolence and his supreme humanism in every corner of the world. Friends, one would wonder what may be the relevance of Gandhi in this all pervading, materialistic, agnostic, and consumerist culture. What is the significance of Gandhi to the modern world, and what is the secret of his success? So many questions. But Gandhiji has been a source of inspiration not only for Indians but for others also. The Tibetan leader Dalai Lama observed that many ancient Indian masters have preached ahimsa, non-violence, as a philosophy. This was mere philosophical understanding. But Mahatma Gandhi, in this 20th century, produced a very sophisticated approach because he implemented that very noble philosophy of ahimsa in modern politics, and he succeeded in doing it. This is a very great thing. Gandhi's phenomenal success in distant South Africa, fighting for human rights and civil liberties, had great impact on Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu. Earlier, Gandhiji's principle had shaped the political sensibility of Martin Luther King. Dr. Martin Luther King was very much inspired by Gandhi, and like Gandhi, he also believed that men should not obey evil or unjust laws. Now, across the world, we see Mahatma Gandhi as an inspiration. Barack Obama, the former US president, said, "In my life, I have always looked to Mahatma Gandhi as an inspiration because he embodies the kind of transformational change that can be made when ordinary people come together to do extraordinary things." Gandhi left many valuable sayings with the modern men to fight for goodness in society in a non-violent way. As he said, good travels at a snail's pace, but this doesn't mean that we should be disappointed or and not go after the good. Gandhi said, non-violence is a tree of slow growth. It grows imperceptibly, but surely. And then he stated, mere goodness is not of much use. Goodness must be joined with knowledge, courage, and conviction. These sayings are imbibed and followed by Jamia in word and spirit, as Gandhiji was so much near Jamia, and so and Jamia is trying to imbibe his sayings. Gandhi successfully demonstrated to a world which is weary with wars and continuing destruction that adherence to truth and non-violence is not meant for individual behavior alone, but have relevance to human affairs nationally and globally. One of the finest tributes to Mahatma Gandhi has been paid by one of the greatest and finest human mind, that was Albert Einstein, who observed that generations to come, it may well be with scarce belief that such a man as this means Gandhi, such a man as this, ever in flesh and blood, has walked upon this earth. Today, in this webinar, we'll be sharing more thoughts about Gandhiji, and for that, eminent panelists are with us, introducing including our Honorable Education Minister, who had already given his address. And before I invite each of the panelists, I would like to introduce them in briefly. I'll invite, I'm extremely delighted to welcome Professor Faisal Devji from the University of Oxford, UK, to this webinar. He's our keynote speaker today, who will deliver a talk on the geography of nonviolence. A very interesting topic. We are immensely thankful to the University of Oxford, UK, for collaborating with us for holding of this webinar, and to Professor Faisal Devji for agreeing to give this lecture. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Faisal Devji before inviting him to deliver his talk. Professor Faisal Devji is a historian who specializes in the studies of globalization, violence, and ethics. Devji was born in Dar es Salaam in 1964 in a family of Western Indian origin. His undergraduate education was at the University of British Columbia, where he received double honors in history and anthropology. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago with his dissertation on Muslim nationalism, founding identity in colonial India, and was chosen to be a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. Devji is Zanjibari and is now a Canadian citizen. He speaks English, French, Gujarati, Hindi, Kutchi, Swahili, Persian, Sindhi, and Urdu. Amazing indeed. And we were talking of multilingual education. Devji's multidisciplinary work grounds empirical history, historical issues in philosophical questions. He has taught at the New School in New York City. He has taught at Yale University. In 2005, Cornell University Press published his Landscapes of the Jihad, Militancy, Morality, Modernity, exploring the ethical content of jihad as opposed to its more widely studied political content. His next book was The Terrorist in Search of Humanity, Militants, Islam and Global Politics. This was published by Columbia University Press in October 2008. Since 2009, Devji is University Professor in Modern South Asian History, Oxford University. He also is a Senior Fellow at the Institute of Public Knowledge, New York University, and holds a chair at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. He published The Impossible Indian, Gandhi and the Temptation of Violence in March 2011. We are fortunate to have you with us, Professor Devji, and without waiting for more time, I'm inviting you to come and deliver your keynote address. Professor Devji.
Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor. It's an honor to have been invited to speak on the occasion of Jamia's centenary and the 150th anniversary of Gandhiji's birth. I'm very grateful to the Honorable Minister for his words, to you, Vice Chancellor, and to Professor Ravindra Kumar, as well as Professor Mukesh Ranjan, for your presence words. I also wanted to note how appropriate this occasion is, not only because of Jamia's own centenary and Gandhi's birth anniversary, but because of the auspicious event of Janmashtami, auspicious not least because Gandhiji, of course, was named after the child god, Mohandas, as we all know. So I'll begin reading out my lecture. I much look forward to Professor Kumar's comments after it. Now, seen as the father of his nation, Gandhi remains a territorial icon located firmly within the boundaries of India. We all recognize that he was also an imperial and international figure in politics, even one of the first global celebrities of newsreel film. But this role tends to be understood as incidental to the Mahatma's real achievement, which was the founding of a nation state. Not only did Gandhi conceive of his own struggle as potentially global in scope, however, he was not particularly interested in the state and even critical of its modern European form. He understood that India's freedom could not be won without engaging with the world in which she was placed, one whose reality was defined largely in maritime terms. The British Empire, after all, was a maritime power, and India's role within it was defined by the sea as much as it was by land. For India was not simply the object of imperial desire in her own right, but a base from which to provision territories overseas with labor and raw materials, as well as to secure them by the cheap and easy dispatch of troops. From the Arabian to the Caribbean Sea and the Indian Ocean to the Pacific, Indian manpower and natural resources held the empire together. Gandhi realized, therefore, that colonialism would have to be fought on land and sea if it was to be truly defeated, and I want in this lecture to describe how we conceptualize the relations between these two arenas. Like the international order that succeeded it after the First World War, imperialism entailed a specific relationship of land to sea, the former representing the realm of legal and social particularity, and the latter of a boundless universality. In economic terms, this relationship was defined as that between protectionism and free trade. Laissez-faire had been the ideological form that Britain's naval supremacy took, while controls and restrictions of various kinds were upheld as the realm of domestic sovereignty. Similarly, the universality of international law held sway over the seas in contrast to the sovereign particularity of the territorial state. This difference is what allowed Indians to be treated as equals in Britain, but unequally at home. Indian nationalists were divided about this dual character of the imperial and later international order, demarcated as it was by the relationship of sea to land. They tended either to want a laissez-faire universalism in which India and England were equals, or a protectionism which retained the former's distinctiveness in a positive rather than negative way. Nehru, for instance, spoke in The Discovery of India about the two Englands, one the land of liberty and John Stuart Mill, and the other an oppressive colonial power. He wanted England to remain true to her better self. But Gandhi understood that the two Englands were in fact one and the same, each made possible by the other, just like the particular and the universal. The Mahatma called the universal claims of capital and law modern civilization, which he thought destroyed even the particularities it was meant to preserve in forms like sexual or racial difference. While Britain, Europe, or the West might think of themselves as the originators of this civilization, in other words, they could not, he argued, hold possession of it for very long, soon being reduced to particularities and exploited in their own right. By pointing out the risks involved in such a dualistic conception of imperial order, Gandhi recognized its fundamental weakness. His German contemporary, the jurist Carl Schmitt, elaborated the problem this caused precisely by considering the relationship of land and sea. Britain's world empire was scattered across the surface of the earth, lacking any spatial integrity. Its amplitude could not be grasped except by attending to the smallest land and water bridges that linked one portion of the empire to another. This is why the British were fixated with the security of otherwise minor bodies of water, from the English Channel and the Suez Canal to the Straits of Gibraltar, Hormuz, and Malacca. Many of these maritime locations, including bases and coaling stations like Aden, Singapore, and Hong Kong, remain crucial to global politics and capitalism into our own day. But for Schmitt, they served as illustrations of the British Empire's lack of territorial integrity and inability to manage its own plenitude in any spatially coherent way. Not only was the empire's amorphous universality represented by the sea, for Schmitt it was also put into practice there in the form of humanitarianism. British imperialism, he maintained, expressed its universal claims in the language of what we might today call humanitarian intervention, whose exemplary manifestation came to be the abolition of slavery. As part of a humanitarian imperative, The Royal Navy could break all illegal conventions by boarding and impounding even foreign vessels on the high seas that were suspected of carrying slave cargo. Linked to this practice and with us to this day were the Navy's use of sanctions and blockades, again for ostensibly humanitarian reasons. Clearly, these forms were only possible across maritime rather than territorial borders. Humanitarianism, of course, was crucial in the legitimization of empire because it took precedence over popular consent and political representation. Conceptualized as a gift to colonized subjects who might not even be able to appreciate it, the humanitarian understanding of imperialism dispensed with their agreement, even as it sought to save some categories of people like women, children, and minorities from others. If the empire's universality was made possible by the sea, then it was given subjective shape in the figure of humanity. In other words, humanitarianism, like free trade and international law, permitted the British Empire to elaborate a universal mission in maritime terms, and at the same time to tolerate or protect exceptions to its logic in territorial ones. The British Empire worked by establishing a distinctive relationship between land and sea, one that possessed economic, juridical, and ethical dimensions. In order to win India's freedom, therefore, the Mahatma had to break this relationship, and I want here to describe the way in which he did this. Gandhi struggled to understand and dismantle the relation of land and sea throughout his career, and I want to focus in particular on how he thought about it by way of the 3 sea voyages he made. These were his journey as a student to London in 1888, as a lawyer to South Africa in 1893, and as a non-violent preacher returning to India in 1914. But I shall begin with the sea's curious absence from Gandhi's account of his childhood in the port city of Porbandar. Now, Gandhi's native Gujarat was famous for the important role it had always played in India's seaborne trade, and he was himself born and brought up in one of its most famous ports. But not only was Gujarat part of the Bombay Presidency, it was also divided between patches of British territory and hundreds of princely states, thus lacking any geographical or administrative integrity of its own. This absence of territorial fixity meant that its links with the Arabian and African settlements where Gujaratis lived were as important in defining the region as the towns and villages from which they hailed. Yet never once in the many pages dedicated to his years in Porbandar does the future Mahatma even mention the sea, to my knowledge, to say nothing about Gujarat's economic dependence on it. The only sense we get of this maritime world is when Gandhi describes his father discussing religious and philosophical matters with the Hindu, Muslim, Parsi, and Jain friends who represented the region's mercantile history. It is almost as if Gujarat's dispersed geography was mirrored in such fragmentary examples of an unthought and barely visible oceanic universe. And this was perhaps because it was a universe that had been occluded by a colonial vision of the sea and its relationship with the land. Indeed, the cosmopolitanism of overseas Indian trade had been reduced to a defensive fixation on maintaining caste rules and restrictions. As with the mutiny of 1857, the admittedly hierarchical pluralism caste represented had been narrowed down to interdictions regarding food and sex. The mutineers had feared what they saw as British attempts to interfere with their sexual and dietary laws. These included conversions to Christianity, miscegenation, and famously breaking the caste and religious identities of Hindus and Muslims by having them bite bullet cartridges greased with cow and pig fat. They thought that such practices would destroy their plurality and turn Indians into undifferentiated slaves of the English without any identities and therefore sovereignty of their own. The mutiny, in other words, brought upper caste Hindus and Muslims together in a partnership of equals for the first time in order to prevent, rather than encourage, their subordination to a single identity, which they could only understand as a servile one. The mutiny's defense of India's plurality still possessed a political form and mode of thinking as embodied by the last Mughal emperor and the pre-colonial order of Maratha supremacy that he represented. But following its crushing defeat, even the memory of such an order was smashed, with the social regulations of endogamy and commensality serving as the depoliticized vestiges of this past. Food and sex, in other words, had become the last remnants of an unequal yet cosmopolitan world, one that could be glimpsed only as a set of irrational particularities within the universal mission of imperialism. The same was true for Gandhi too, whose understanding of Gujarati society was defined by interdictions around bodily pleasure as much as transgression. From his childhood in Porbandar to his student days in London, Gandhi grappled with the twin interdictions of food and sex, which should not simply be seen as a peculiarly traditional inheritance. For Gandhi well understood that they were among the last defenses against the wholesale naturalization of colonial universality in the form of what he called modern civilization. He was first tempted to abandon these restrictions by a friend whom he doesn't name, but who we know was Sheikh Mehtab, whose reasoning, like that of many Indian reformers, had to do with emulating the habits of Englishmen in order to become their equals, if not superiors. In his autobiography, Gandhi quotes a doggerel by the poet Narmad to this effect. Behold the mighty Englishman, he rules the Indians small, because being a meat-eater, he is 5 cubits tall. Mehtab himself, Gandhi tells us, was an object of envy for his fearlessness and physical strength. But rather than attributing these qualities to some native, if nevertheless spurious source like religion, he understood them only in colonial terms as the result of imitating the British. In doing so, Mehtab provided the perfect illustration of the workings of imperialism, because he was unable to understand the relations between different kinds of Indians without their mediation by colonialism. Unlike the mutiny, whose sepoys could conceive a partnership between Hindus and Muslims against the British, Sheikh Mehtab, like many other Indians, was unable to visualize such a relationship because it had been rendered impossible by colonial rule. As an adult, Gandhi would theorize this voiding of relations between Indians belonging to different castes and communities as an aspect of Britain's policy of divide and rule. But rather than seeing it as a deliberate strategy, he understood this process as the logical corollary of imperialism, construed as a specific relationship between the universal and the particular. For its seaborne universality invested the colonial state with the liberal attributes of neutrality and therefore fairness as a rational third party, there to adjudicate between territorial Indian interests consigned by their passion, prejudice, and partiality to the realm of pure particularity. In this sense, the colonial and liberal state were the same, and the former even the latter's truest form in representing neutrality far better than it. The Mahatma would argue later in his career that freedom meant, among other things, reconstituting the social relations among Indians by refusing their mediation and so effective voiding by the state. For any state that functioned according to the relationship of universal and particular would remain a fundamentally imperial institution, one that depended on robbing its subjects of their agency and reducing them to particularities, unable to enter into any relationship with one another apart from itself. But since the state was unable to mediate every relationship all the time, it reduced the units of Indian society to relations of permanent enmity, whose violence required constant recourse to the police and courts, and so strengthened them more and more. Sheikh Mehtab induced Gandhi to break the dietary rules of his religion by eating meat as a kind of anti-colonial duty rather than pleasure. He also tried to break sexual taboos by taking Gandhi to a house of prostitution, but there his friend's shyness overcame the pleasure he was meant to enjoy and prevented any lapse into sin. Yet these transgressions tormented Gandhi into adulthood, and his dealings with them tell us how the Mahatma understood imperialism as a relationship of sea to land and universal to particular. Gandhi, after all, was forbidden to embark on the voyage to London, where he was going, as you know, to study law, by the elders of his caste who feared crossing the waters not for any metaphysical reason, but because he would be unable to maintain his dietary as well as sexual restrictions and therefore a Hindu identity there. Having refused to obey his caste leaders, Gandhi was duly outcast by them, but nevertheless continued to observe Hinduism's sexual and dietary rules, even as the latter were immediately put into question on his journey out. Afraid of accidentally eating something forbidden and embarrassed by his table manners and painful shyness, Gandhi ate the food he had brought on board in his cabin. He also followed custom in asking English passengers to provide him with certificates attesting to his vegetarianism, until he found out that these were to be had for a price, even for those who had not observed any dietary restrictions. Now, the arguments against vegetarianism as a religious practice were all universalistic in character. Not only were Hindu, and for that matter Muslim, dietary restrictions understood as irrationally territorial particularisms by those speaking on behalf of modern civilization, but animal protein seen as essential in colder climes and sometimes even medically required. Initially, Gandhi's justification for refusing to give in to such universalistic reasoning had to do with the promises to abstain from meat that he had made his mother. Instead of confirming his royal loyalty to a religion defined as the very instantiation of particularism, in other words, Gandhi undercut the rationale of universalism by referring to a purely moral commitment that could be defined neither in one way nor the other. In London, Gandhi joined a vegetarian society and started thinking about his food habits in more scientific ways, but he never made of them simply an alternative form of universal reasoning, and in fact expanded his conception of moral duty precisely to undo the relationship of particular and universal, land and sea, that defined both imperialism and modern civilization more generally. Diet, therefore, became a site of moral rather than merely cultural difference, its restrictions illustrating, just as in the mutiny, the Indian subject's sovereign agency, not his unthinking obedience to some archaic superstition. And I quote Gandhiji from his autobiography. For me, the question of diet was not one to be determined on the authority of the Shastras. It was one interwoven with my course of life, which is guided by principles no longer depending upon outside authority. I had no desire to live at the cost of them. Unquote. As we know, the Mahatma would go much beyond vegetarianism to experiment with different kinds of dietary restriction, including the fasts for which he became famous, and which re-politicized eating for the first time since the mutiny's response to cartridges greased with animal fat. But if he broke food's links with Indian particularity and so political passivity by invoking duty, Gandhi approached sex by referring to providence. Of the 4 instances of illicit sexual temptation Gandhi describes in his autobiography, at least 2 are associated with the sea as a boundless site of promiscuous mixing. Here is his description of one such encounter. Quote, during the last year, as far as I can remember of my stay in England, that is in 1890, there was a vegetarian conference at Portsmouth to which an Indian friend and I were invited. Portsmouth is a seaport with a large naval population. It has many houses with women of ill fame, women who not actually prostitutes, but at the same time not very scrupulous about their morals. We returned from the conference in the evening. After dinner, we sat down to play a rubber of bridge, in which our landlady joined, as is customary in England, even in respectable households. Every player indulges in innocent jokes as a matter of course, but here my companion and our hostess began to make indecent ones as well. I did not know that my friend was an adept in the art. It captured me and I also joined in. Just when I was about to go beyond the limit, leaving the cards and the game to themselves, God, through the good companion, uttered the blessed warning. Whence this devil in you, my boy? Be off, quick. I was ashamed. I took the warning and expressed within myself gratefulness to my friend. Remembering the vow I had taken before my mother, I fled from the scene. To my room, I went quaking, trembling, and with a beating heart, like a quarry escaped from its pursuer. Close quote. Now, as with his justification of dietary restrictions, Gandhi refers to vows given his mother when describing sexual temptation here. But unlike his firm refusal to compromise on the question of food, Gandhi is adamant that he was saved from sexual degradation not by his own will, but that of God. Already in his first encounter with the prostitute to whom Sheikh Mehtab had taken him in Porbandar, the young Gandhi was saved by what he then despised as his shyness, only to realize much later that it was in fact a sign of divine providence. Quote, I sat near the woman on her bed, but I was tongue-tied. She naturally lost patience with me and showed me the door with abuses and insults. I then felt as though my manhood had been injured and wished to sink into the ground for shame. But I have ever since given thanks to God for having saved me. I can recall 4 more similar incidents in my life, and in most of them my good fortune, rather than any effort on my part, saved me. Close quote. Now, important about providence was the fact that it was unwilled and so constructed the moral self differently from the way duty did. And for Gandhi, providence was crucial because it presented a limit to the kind of moral calculus that sought to draw all action into a framework of prediction and control. As a reader of the Bhagavad Gita, of course, Gandhi was set against this highly instrumental way of understanding moral action, since that text famously counseled doing one's duty without any consideration of its result. By conceptualizing moral action as a sacrifice without recompense, the Gita sought to free it from the law of karma's endless cycle of cause and effect. Gandhi, however, was also interested in how, by disdaining its result, action left the future open by preserving many moral ends rather than simply one in a zero-sum game. He understood that even if moral action achieved its desired result, it was unable to predict or control the consequences that followed. This is why he refused to sacrifice means for ends, not only because of the violence it entailed, but also because ends could never truly be determined in advance. By leaving such ends aside, then, moral action and duty welcomed and made providence possible in the form of the incalculable, which Gandhi frequently described as the incarnation of God, of Vishnu, on earth. And it was precisely the incalculable that came to Gandhi's aid when he was about to succumb to sexual temptation. Now, the sharing of food and sex along with communication are also the conventional markers of human solidarity. Yet Gandhi realized that language or reason, one of the classical qualities defining humanity, is notoriously unreliable in creating solidarity because it is unequally distributed and recognized. Meanwhile, sexual and commensal relations are as likely to promote violence as its opposite. He was also suspicious of such biological conceptions of humanity, which he thought simply expanded racist and other forms of exclusionary reasoning to the whole of mankind, because after all, racism is based precisely on the idea of biological similarity and identity. Unsurprisingly, the Mahatma was more interested in moral definitions of humanity, especially those that repudiated any vision of its undifferentiated universality. In his 1909 manifesto, Hind Swaraj, written on board the Kildonan Castle as she sailed from England to South Africa, Gandhi argued, quote, I am so constructed that I can only serve my immediate neighbors. But in my conceit, I pretend to have discovered that I must, with my body, serve every individual in the universe. In thus attempting the impossible, man comes in contact with different natures, different religions, and is utterly confounded. Man here in the Gujarati text is Manas Jat, literally mankind. Now, close quote. Appearing in a chapter on railways and the hubris of world mastery, they, like all technology created, Gandhi's refusal of humanitarianism's universal mission was clearly directed at the role it played in imperialism. But it also pointed to the way in which such universalization made social particularity into a problem. Schmidt had argued that by making humanity into the object of its politics, the British Empire eventually ended up dealing with its enemies by dehumanizing. As a political ideology, in other words, humanitarianism led to the exclusion and even annihilation of some of its members, something that was by no means unfamiliar under colonial rule. And it is from here that Gandhi's worry about the humanitarian being confounded by social difference understood as a territorial particularity, came. For it was always the particular that could be made into an exception and eliminated from the oceanic embrace of the human race. It was against this logic that he defended the dietary and sexual restrictions that made for India's pluralism, but without consigning them to the realm of the particular. The Mahatma did not define humanity as a self-enclosed identity, with humanitarianism as its narcissistic counterpart, but instead sought to open it up to the non-human as a promise rather than a threat. The Hindu practice of cow protection provided one site at which this opening could occur, and Gandhi chose it precisely because the cow had become such a flashpoint for Hindu-Muslim violence. Instead of simply representing it as an example to follow, in other words, Gandhi defined cow protection as a non-violent practice capable of tolerating rather than eliminating social difference. And he did so by pointing out its moral as opposed to biological character, one that rejected the humanitarian ideal of a shared language, sexuality, and alimentation. The cow stood for all non-human life, and for Gandhi, her care was truly humanitarian because it allowed men to exit their own species by creating a moral relationship with life forms that did not depend upon their similarity to us. Only because no generalized sexual, linguistic, or dietary communion could exist between humans and animals, in other words, might their relations become truly moral and therefore nonviolent. Our care for animals as much as fellow human beings, he thought, occurs in the absence of any sure knowledge about or identity with them, revealing its most pure manifestation in sacrifice for the other. And in this way, Gandhi managed to break open colonial humanitarianism without proposing an alternative universality. While his voyage to London allowed Gandhi to discover India outside the colonial relationship of universal and particular, and I have focused on his attention to sexual and food restrictions, the journey to South Africa permitted him to question what it was to be an Indian. Upon arriving in Durban, he discovered a Gulliver's world of topsy-turvy relations, where a Gujarati elite composed of Muslim merchants and their Hindu and Parsi clerks struggled to distinguish themselves from the South and North Indian indentured and free laborers who comprised the majority of the Indian population. Regularly identified with these latter by South African whites, the upper caste traders and their employees insisted on taking on new identities, and I quote, "In the course of these 2 or 3 days, I could see that the Indians were divided into different groups. One was that of Mussalman merchants who would call themselves Arabs. Another was that of Hindu, and yet another of Parsi clerks. The Hindu clerks were neither here nor there unless they cast in their lot with the Arabs. The Parsi clerks would call themselves Persians. These three classes had some social relations with one another, but by far the largest class was that composed of Tamil, Telugu, and North Indian indentured and free laborers." Close quote. And yet, the more Indians in South Africa emphasized their assumed identities, the more tenuous these became. In his autobiography, Gandhi describes how his compatriots resented the use of terms like Sami and Coolie for them, trying to wheedle South Africans, white South Africans, to identify them in other ways. I quote, "Whenever, therefore, an Indian resented being addressed as Sami, of course, you know the South Indian word Swami, and had enough wit in him, he would try to return the compliment in this wise. You may call me Sammy, but you forget that Sammy means master. I am not your master." Some Englishmen would wince at this, while others would get angry, swear at the Indian, and, if there was a chance, would even belabor him. For Sammy to him was nothing better than a term of contempt. Close quote. Gandhi himself adopted forms of dress that would distinguish him from the others. His first struggle in South Africa was to be admitted to court wearing a Bengali pagri that he thought marked him out as a modern Indian. And in 1896, when he returned to South Africa after a trip to India, bringing his family with him, the future Mahatma describes how he insisted on prescribing what they had to wear. Quote, "I therefore determined the style of dress for my wife and children. How could I like them to be known as Kathiawad Banians? The Parsis used then to be regarded as the most civilized people among Indians. And so, when the complete European style seemed to be unsuited, we adopted the Parsi style. Accordingly, my wife wore the Parsi sari and the boys the Parsi coat and trousers. Of course, no one could be without shoes and stockings. It was long before my wife and children could get used to them. The shoes cramped their feet and the stockings stank with perspiration. The toes often got sore. Close quote. Since Gandhi had spoken to the press before leaving India about the worsening treatment of Indians in South Africa, he was greeted by a hostile crowd upon disembarking in Durban and nearly lynched before being spirited away to the house of a friend. But the crowd followed him there, and Gandhi had to escape in order to save his family, who had been brought there separately. At the suggestion of Durban's police superintendent, he donned a disguise and so assumed yet another identity in what makes a frightening event seem like a piece of burlesque theater. Quote, as suggested by the superintendent, I put on an Indian constable's uniform and wore on my head a Madrasi scarf wrapped around a plate to serve as a helmet. 2 detectives accompanied me, one of them disguised as an Indian merchant and with his face painted to resemble that of an Indian. Unquote. What all of these incidents demonstrate is the fact that Indian identities were both fluid and transient things. That did not make them superficial, though Gandhi did suggest this was the case for his own sartorial experiments. But it certainly revealed how irrelevant all such claims and expressions were politically. The problem was not that such forms of identification were either weak or inauthentic, only that their assumption for the reason of gaining some material advantage was wrong and therefore unviable. For of course, if people call themselves Arabs or Persians or try to dress in Parsi form or in any other way, they were trying to, as it were, curry favor among white South Africans. And so Gandhi would go on to reconstruct the Indian subject in a quite different way. Gandhi began by suggesting that the discrimination upper castes faced in South Africa was a punishment for their own treatment of lower castes in India, making a moral issue of it that typically turned actual victims into prospective agents. He refuses to recognize victims only as victims and agents only as agents. But while he was keen to have them all identify as Indians, Gandhi did not argue that such unity would save his compatriots from their predicament. For one thing, he would never abandon the discrete castes and communities by whose names Indians identified each other, not least because these were the only groups that possessed some measure of political agency in the colonial state. When the Mahatma launched his first mass campaign in India after the First World War, and of which the foundation of Jamia, of course, is an example, he called upon the country's communities and castes to non-cooperate with the state, since they were the only social groupings that could administer themselves without reference to it. For as Indians alone, they were defined by the colonial state and therefore unable to act without it. But Gandhi also distrusted the self-interest that gave all identities their political meaning. In Hind Swaraj, he pointed out the ambiguity of interest, itself the fundamental category of liberal thought, describing how Indians had come to be colonized precisely by self-interest, because they wanted the goods and services the British provided. Similarly, he realized that Indian traders in South Africa were willing to put up with the racial discrimination they faced out of self-interest, as long as they gained from it financially. He was struck by these men's rueful statements about pocketing insults as they did cash, enough to repeat it several times in his autobiography. Interest, after all, was also a capitalist category describing both material and psychological forms of ownership. One could only have an interest in something from which some advantage could be derived, and so it became a kind of property even as an identity. This is why voting rights in Gandhi's day were restricted to owners of physical or intellectual property who were understood as being invested and so having an interest in politics. Like the imperial idea of humanity as a universal form made possible by the technologies of conquest, interest in its most basic unit as self-interest was considered a universal and so natural quality. It was, however, part of an economic theory about human behavior seen as being motivated primarily by the maximization of self-interest. Even altruism in the utilitarian philosophy that undergirded so much of the colonial enterprise was understood as creating the optimal context for self-interest to operate. Acts of disinterestedness and sacrifice that could not be folded into this theory, as many examples of so-called Indian superstition were not, had therefore to be defined as irrational, unnatural, and territorially particularistic. By repudiating identity as a form of self-interest, then, Gandhi sought to redefine it politically without lapsing into the false choice between what was universal and particular. It was sacrifice, he argued, rather than interest, that should constitute what it meant to be Indian. Just as humanitarianism meant going beyond the human, in other words, so too did all the lesser and greater forms of Indian identity acquire moral and political meaning by opening themselves to a world outside their confines in gestures of self-abnegating duty. Since the capitalist conception of property that made interest possible had not yet come to define the entirety of Indian social relations, thought Gandhi, such acts of sacrifice remained relatively commonplace and invariably characterized familial and other intimate relations. They were, in other words, not part of any utopian vision, but eminently real and so capable of being expanded politically as much as socially. Now, by the time Gandhi returned to India in 1914, he had learned how to dismantle the universalistic pretensions of imperialism in the form of modern civilization without adopting the status of Indian particularity either. We might say that he refused to take his position either on land or sea, and thus undid the relationship between them that defined colonialism. This frequently meant occupying no specific place and simply interrupting the expansive narratives of universality by breaking the links of causality on which they tended to depend. It was, of course, a lesson he had learned from the Gita, which counseled separating means from ends and therefore causes from effects, so as to snap the chain of karma that bound individuals to an endless cycle of rebirth. What Gandhi did was to build an entirely novel politics out of this moral insight. Gandhi often interrupted the apparently inexorable and expansive causal links of his own narratives by introducing different kinds of trajectories within them. We can see this happening in the account of his near lynching in Durban that I described earlier. Surrounded by a crowd, Gandhi and his friend Mr. Lawton initially thought to escape in a hand-pulled rickshaw until its owner ran off, and in doing so, we are told, saved the future Mahatma from the sin of riding on such a dehumanizing form of conveyance. While it might sound like sanctimony, this little interruption of a violent narrative suddenly introduces a quite different moral consideration into it, one that is deliberately out of place. Shortly afterwards, when recounting the crowd's attack on him, Gandhi interrupts the narrative again. Quote, "They first got hold of Mr. Lawton and separated us. Then they pelted me with stones, brickbats, and rotten eggs. Someone snatched away my turban, while others began to batter and kick me. I fainted and caught hold of the front railings of a house and stood there to get my breath. They came upon me boxing and battering. The wife of the police superintendent who knew me happened to be passing by. The brave lady came up, opened a parasol, though there was no sun then, and stood between the crowd and me." Close quote. Now, why mention the fact that the police superintendent's wife opened her umbrella to protect him, even though there was no sun to warrant it? Surely the context in both the Gujarati and English text is clear. But what the interruption effects is a breach in the narrative's causal sequence by intruding an apparently bizarre new element into it. Evident throughout his career as a Mahatma, this logic of interruption characterized many of Gandhi's political experiments as well. This is especially evident in Gandhi's much derided efforts to demonstrate his loyalty to the empire in the first half of his career. For these expressions of loyalty followed a logic entirely separate from that enjoined by the British, seeking to interrupt and so transform it from the inside. From his South African activism starting late in the 19th century until the end of the First World War and even beyond, Gandhi had worked to radicalize loyalty to the British Empire in order to transform the vast concourse of humanity it represented from within and for the benefit of all its subjects, whether Indian or not. He could do this because sovereignty, Swaraj or self-rule, was understood not merely in collective or institutional terms, but as a quality dispersed among individuals whose non-violent practices were meant to revolutionize social relations and therefore political ones by default. It didn't much matter, therefore, what kind of political regime existed, with empires and nation-states being seen as equally violent but also superficial and so amenable to an internal transformation. Gandhi's loyalty to the empire was independent as well as radical because it was detached from the aims and propaganda of the colonial state. His acts of organizing an Indian ambulance corps during the Boer and Zulu wars in the first years of the 20th century, as well as in England at the First World War's commencement, were all marked by an unconcern with which side was right or wrong in each conflict. In fact, his own sympathies were with the Boers and Zulus in the first two wars, and he insisted on serving their wounded as well as those of the British. Indian participation in these South African events was meant to return the humanitarian gift of imperialism. Instead, Gandhi offered Britain a gift of loyalty that was meant to force the recognition of Indians as equal citizens of the empire. With the Great War, this reasoning changed slightly, as Gandhi, who reached London in 1914, grappled with the problem of abstaining from the conflict while yet living under the protection of the Royal Navy. Since he thought this amounted to benefiting from violence, Gandhi decided that volunteering for ambulance service on the Western Front would at least cancel out the sin of such vicarious participation in war by deliberately putting oneself at risk. The ambulance corps was meant to break the chain of karma that linked its members to violence. The closer Gandhi approached the war as a loyal subject, in other words, the more distant he was from its aims and ethos, having turned it into the scene for a quite different moral trial. And of course, as with the Boer and Zulu wars, in the First World War, Gandhi proposed that his ambulance corps would treat Germans, French and English without any differentiation. In 1918, when he was back in India, Gandhi also embarked upon a largely unsuccessful mission to recruit soldiers. As with the ambulance corps, Gandhi's argument for recruitment was independent. On the one hand, India's participation in the war was meant to achieve home rule for her and equality within the empire. On the other hand, Gandhi offered far more intriguing reasons than home rule to his allies, not all of whom shared his belief in nonviolence. By making themselves responsible for recruitment, Gandhi contended Indians would automatically switch the allegiance of soldiers to their own countrymen and civilians outside government. In the process, they would also allay the risk of military rule at the end of the war when large numbers of soldiers returned and were used against the national movement. But he also thought that in order to claim their freedom, Indians should learn to risk their lives, which made the war into an arena for another kind of political morality and experiment. Indeed, recruits might even be able to demonstrate the power of nonviolence on the battlefields of Europe. However serious, disingenuous, or bizarre these ideas, it should be clear that Gandhi's loyalty was detached from the expansive colonial logic of cause and effect, and at least intellectually free. He had already disengaged from the war and even British rule while still participating in both, having made it the site for an entirely different moral experiment. This practice of interruption, however, was not confined to imperialism, and Gandhi deployed it even against the Congress and people when necessary. So, having struggled for much of his career to dismantle the relationship between land and sea that defined imperialism as much as modern civilization, with its narrative of universal and particular, Gandhi ended up erasing the dividing line that both joined and separated the two. In the Salt March of 1930, for example, he returned to the Gujarati coast on which he had been born and brought up to focus the attention of Indians upon the very edge of the territory they wanted to make their own. By retrieving salt from the sea, he not only broke the law that made its manufacture a colonial monopoly, but in doing so also decentered the territorial imagination of Indian nationalism by including the sea within it. With the Quit India movement of 1942, the Mahatma invoked India's maritime borders again, asking the British to leave the country in the same manner they had arrived in it, by way of the sea. India, of course, was a major source of labor, fighting men, raw materials, and food grains for the empire during the Second World War, all of which were procured in the name of collective security, necessity, and obligation. Gandhi was not against India's participation in the war effort, but argued that it would be most effective when freely made. If Britain was fighting for freedom against fascist dictatorship, in other words, she would have to demonstrate it by freeing India for a relationship based on trust rather than force. Instead of defending India against the sea and its logic of universality, in other words, in his last great mobilizations, the Mahatma seemed to be pushing towards it in different ways. And I can do no better than end this lecture with a remarkable illustration of this movement from an article he wrote in his journal Harijan towards the end of July 1946. Contrasting the hierarchical structure of the pyramid, itself a symbol of territorial empire, to the freedom of the ocean, Gandhi imagines India's future on the eve of her independence as one defined by the centripetal movement of democratic decision-making, beginning with individuals and villages and expanding outwards in a kind of wave without any one side of democracy commanding another. I quote, "In this structure, composed of innumerable villages, there will be ever-widening, never-ascending circles. Life will not be a pyramid with the apex sustained by the bottom, but it will be an oceanic circle whose center will be the individual always ready to perish for the village, the latter ready to perish for the circle of villages, till at last the whole becomes one life composed of individuals never aggressive in their arrogance but ever humble, sharing the majesty of the oceanic circle of which they are integral units." Close quote. At the end of his life, then, the Mahatma joined land to sea by refusing any distinction between them. No longer was the universality of one to be defined by the particularity of the other in a relationship of forced dependency that was as much epistemological as it was economic and political. Instead, territorial hierarchies were literally to be washed out to sea in a tide of freedom where no border existed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 1 hour of just listening to you was so informative, and you have just painted a picture before our eyes of an age that we never witnessed. And Mahatma's role in India's independence struggle is very well painted by you here. From a historian's point of view and from a person, from the geographical point of view also. We never looked at it like that as you made it clear here. Your address also gave us an image of Gandhi as a person with weaknesses and strengths, and also it took us on the journey of making from Gandhi to Mahatma. Professor Devji, I must confess that I envy the students of Oxford who can sit in your class and listen to your lectures every day. So thank you for coming to Jamia, and we have earlier read about you, but today we have seen you and heard you. So we desire to have a longer relationship between Oxford and Jamia, and also with you. Please do keep in touch. Address our teachers whenever it's possible. Address our teachers and students online or offline. and do visit Jamia, not like this, but in person. Thank you very much. It's not, I am very happy to welcome Professor Ravindra Kumar ji, the former Vice Chancellor of Meerut University, who has carved a niche for himself as an educationist and esteemed Gandhian scholar. Actually, it's from being a vice chancellor, being called as a Gandhian scholar is a more honor, and that makes you stand apart. I welcome him to this webinar as a discussant who would reflect upon Gandhian thought and philosophy and also respond to some of the issues raised by Professor Faisal Devji in his presentation. I have the honor of introducing, just to give me another minute to introduce you to the audience who are listening from far and wide. Professor Ravindra Kumar was born in 1959, is a political scientist, peace educator, an Indologist, a humanist, cultural anthropologist, Gandhian thinker, and besides that, the former Vice Chancellor of PCS University, Meerut. Currently, he is an ombudsman of Swami Vivekanand Subhati University, Meerut, and the editor-in-chief of Global Peace International Journal. He has written more than 100 books and 400 articles on greatest personalities of Indian subcontinent, including Gautam Buddha, Swami Vivekanand, Mahatma Gandhi, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, and in various social, political, educational, cultural, and academic issues, they are to his credit. A well-known Indologist, Professor Kumar has been associated with several national and international academic, cultural, educational, peace and social bodies, institutions and organizations. As an international professor and a cultural ambassador of India, he has delivered more than 400 lectures at various institutions and universities of the world related to Asian values, civilization, culture, Gandhian philosophy, international cooperation, and understanding leadership, ways of life, women's empowerment, world peace, youth affairs, etc. As a peace worker, Professor Kumar started Peace Review, an international journal of peace studies in 1998, and worked as an editor-in-chief of that journal. In 2001, Professor Kumar started Global Peace, another international journal of philosophy, peace, education, culture, and civilization. Besides, he has inspired hundreds and thousands of people all over the world for their commitment towards non-violence by signing pledges. Between 1993 and 2015, Ravindra Kumar ji had organized a number of seminars, symposium, and workshops at national as well as international level on subjects relating to value education, religion and politics, non-violence, democracy, morality, ethics in public life, human values and rights, education, peace and development, and of course on Gandhian philosophy. He has authored several books and it's a very long list, so it will not be possible for me to read it out. but in him I'm happy to welcome a very learned person and an appropriate person to speak here on Gandhian philosophy, Professor Ravindra Kumar.
Professor Devji, convener Professor Ranjan ji, all present distinguished scholars there, and participants of the event. I am grateful to the Jamia Millia Islamia working in these days, because I know a man of political science, basically, or philosophy, under the dynamic leadership of Dr. Najma Akhar ji. Najma ji, you are a symbol of women empowerment as well.
Thank you.
No need to say more about me, because I have very good relations, but long ago, with your institution. He was very senior to me by age, Lieutenant General Jati, the Vice Chancellor of it. I was the VC at the age of less than 35, maybe the youngest at Merit, but he was quite senior. And suddenly, once I visited to him, but suddenly in 2001, we suddenly met at the Rashtrapati Bhavan. Me and Jackie both got that year the Padma Award, Padma Shri. After that, I could not make it convenient to go for many regions to go around. But today, when I see the working under you, and just what I mean, so I'm very happy. And the initiative you took today, organizing such a timely event in Jamia, with which Dr. Mukhtar Ahmad Ansari, Dr. Hakim Ajmal Khan, such people has been associated. So मेरा सीना गर्व से जरा भारी होता है, और मैं समझता हूं कि आपकी लीडरशिप में ये बहुत आगे बढ़ेगी, और सही जो दिशा थी, the same direction, डॉक्टर अंसारी की, हकीम अजमल खान की, और लोगों की, जाकिर साहब की, तो वो उसकी तरफ आगे बढ़ेगी. Gandhian thought or philosophy has been understood and explained by scholars and subject specialists from time to time all over the world as per their own interpretations of his ideology. The story continues till date. Mahatma Gandhi, with a single objective, struggled throughout his life at many fronts to achieve his objectives. And as we all know, his ideas or philosophy developed from those very years of struggle, experimenting and implementing his ideas. Accepting one or more than one of his approaches as the most important from his works, from the large-scale welfare of the people viewpoint, scholars explain Gandhi Vichar or philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi accordingly, to say, having the same work of experiments of the Mahatma in the center. At the core of Mahatma Gandhi's entire idea is the reality of indivisible whole, Avibhajya Sampurnata. Gandhi Darshan is dedicated to the truth of universal unity, Sarvabhaumik Ekta. Gandhi's philosophy moves forward by connecting all spheres of life, socio-cultural, political, intellectual, religious, spiritual, and economic as one, due to their inevitable interdependence. Due to this, Gandhian thought, which seems to be very simple, has its own special place in all the philosophies developed around the world from time to time. This truth is well revealed when one goes into the depth of views expressed by Mahatma Gandhi on almost all subjects related to all walks of life, periodically, and course of action set by him. It clearly appears that Mahatma Gandhi firmly believed in the reality of complete perfection and unity of all. And he worked throughout his life having this truth as the nucleus, as his operational strategy. It was the result of acceptance of this reality by the Mahatma that he worked in all walks of life and continuously struggled for human equality, making it as the prime objective of his life. I have indicated this in the beginning of my talk. Equality is of paramount importance in the truth-based eternal principle of indivisible whole and universal unity. It is the nucleus of his undying reality. Gandhi ji well realized this in South Africa. Devji was hinting or explaining this fact, where he discovered an unprecedented weapon of satyagraha, purely based on ahimsa, non-violence. This is why equality remained at the center of all of his works. Struggles in South Africa, followed by India. This state is quite clear from a short statement made by Mahatma Gandhi himself in Young India on March 12, 1925. He said, "My central aim is equal treatment for whole of humanity, and that equal treatment means equality of service. Equality is the natural right of everyone from the Lord, our Creator. It is the most valuable ornament of life." Three other important aspects related to human life: freedom, justice, and rights are intertwined, connected with equality. Since ancient times, great man of the era, leading figure from the field of religion of the Dharma, which leaves deep impact on human life, always kept human equality highest in their messages. They expected man to treat each other equally. In the scriptures also, the aspect of human equality emerged in the most prominent form. However, the establishment of human equality is perhaps the most difficult task. Even after accepting the reality of human equality in principle, true action on the same is quite difficult. There are some particular reasons behind this state. However, we will leave those details for a later going discussion. I can do that on some particular occasion. But still, I want to say that the sense of inequality and unequal conduct of man with fellow beings are the cause of all difficulties, problems, and conflicts at all levels and in all spheres of life. In the entire philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi, decentralization of power, trusteeship in the economic sphere, upliftment of rural sector, women empowerment, and other constructive activities, 4-point education plan, Antyodaya to Sarvodaya Yojana, establishment of an ideal democracy, the Ramarajya, the spirit of human equality remained the most valuable and desirable. Similarity of this, the foremost purpose of all of his non-violent struggles, satyagrahas, for freedom, justice, and rights, was to bring everyone within the realm of equality. It was to pave the way for self-reliance of everyone by providing equal opportunity to one and all. The true familiarity with Gandhian thought, therefore, I believe, can only be possible by keeping his equality-related ideas in the center. Professor Faisal Devji has very nicely covered through his lecture the geography aspect of non-violence under the theme Gandhian Thought and Philosophy. Dr. Devji, we learned so much from you. Thank you. While not exceeding the prescribed time limit and thanking Professor Faisal Devji, I would like to mention only one thing in context of Gandhian non-violence. I have taught a special course under UNESCO in Spain, University of Jom, under this title in 2001, covering all aspects. But what I want to say today is this, that non-violence or ahimsa is the basis of the Gandhian thought. It is the means to achieve the goal. So much is said about the utility and relevance of the Gandhian non-violence, sometimes quite senseless things. Despite this, fair and prejudice-free familiarity with Gandhian concept related to the basic spirit of non-violence and its acid test is indeed credible. Active goodwill, we have to learn, but I am going to say these words. Active goodwill towards living being is the basic spirit of non-violence of the Gandhian view. And intent underlying the act is the acid test of Gandhiji's ahimsa. One goes familiar with this truth, she or he will realize and understand himself or herself the uniqueness and all-timely significance of Gandhian non-violence. Thank you very much, madam. Thank you again for inviting me on this very important occasion, and I hope that this process of your lecture series or organizing event will continue. Thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you. Today, I'm really sorry that we have such good speakers, such eminent people, and very limited time, and that encourages us to have full time with each speaker separately, and giving this opportunity to our students and teachers to talk to them face to face at some time, because we are very hopeful that one day ऐसा दिन आएगा हमारे सामने होंगे, कोविड नहीं होगा, COVID-19 नहीं होगा उस वक्त। I'm extremely grateful, both of you who came from, who has given us their valuable time, and Professor Ravindra Kumar ji, you are staying in Meerut.
मेरठ अभी आकर नोएडा में हूँ।
अच्छा, but which is not very far from here.
Yes, yes, sir.
But for us to listen to a good speaker and a person who is of eminence, UK भी बहुत दूर नहीं है हमसे।
हाँ, बिल्कुल।
So while a formal vote of thanks will follow, but I take this opportunity not only to thank the speakers, and particularly thank our first speaker, our Minister of Education, Shri Ramesh Pokhriyal ji, who snatched these minutes out of an important meeting and gave it to us for this, and we are definitely obliged for his presence and encouraged by his guidance. So thank you. I'll request my registrar, Mr. Siddiqui, AP Siddiqui, to give a formal vote of thanks, which is very much needed after these eminent lectures and after the address of the minister at the end of the.
Thank you very much, ma'am. It's my proud privilege to extend the formal vote of thanks on the occasion of the 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. First of all, it was a great privilege for the Jamia that the Honorable Minister for Education, Union Minister, Shri Ramesh Pokhriyal ji, despite his pressing engagements, the India at the verge of transformation of the education policies, and after 34 years of the education policies being charted out, and a lot of transformation is being done. And of course, the minister is very busy, but he chose to spare the time and reflect his love for the Jamia, Gandhi's contribution to the freedom struggle and shaping of the Jamia. And we are overwhelmed by his gracing the occasion though for a brief moment, but we are really very thankful to the Honorable Minister for sparing that time and encouraging us. I also take this opportunity to thank our Vice Chancellor, esteemed Vice Chancellor, who, despite the shortcomings of the pandemic and the problems, the commemoration of the Gandhi, because Gandhi is so close to our heart, so she never wanted to miss that opportunity to showcase our love to the world of Gandhi's special affiliation and her guidance, and the formulating of this webinar on the Gandhian philosophy and thought is remarkable, and this provides us opportunity to listen to a very eminent panelist, which will go a long way for all the scholars who are listening and the academic fraternity. Next, coming to Dr. Faisal Devji, this reminds me of which I read, that every successful man, the first 100 pages of the autobiography is interesting because that showcases the struggle of the man. The depiction of Gandhiji, his transformation as Mahatma by Dr. Faisal Devji was so mesmerizing, as if you were watching the Gandhiji as a child to the youth, and as an adult, and as a Mahatma. So this was really a very privileged lecture which we heard from Dr. Faisal Devji, his experiences and his past association with the Jamia and area, of course. We hope that in future also will be benefited by his rich experiences and his scholarly depth. Coming to, of course, there is a shortage of time. I will only say that Gandhiji, as a Mahatma, as a Rashtrapita, and as a Bapu, his embodiment of aparigraha, non-possession, so steeped was Gandhi in his ethos of aparigraha, that when he was asked why did he travel in train in a third-class compartment, he said, because there is no fourth class. So that was the Gandhi. Just as Gandhi keeps coming to us through an intimate, autobiographical, and self-reflective cut, we keep going back to him through a series of communing experiences. The fact is that after wandering away from its unique inspirations, the Indian democracy indeed repeatedly keeps coming back to Gandhi's mode of discourse. Not since a lot of time has already taken up, and once again, I take this opportunity for the special privilege of the Jamia academic community for listening to Dr. Faisal Devji, and finally, Dr. Professor Ravindra Kumar, who has long associations of the Indian polity. His work on the ground level is very, very rich experiences, and already the Vice Chancellor has extended the invitation because he is very close by to Jamia to listen to him in the future. Once again, thank you very much for providing us the opportunity to understand Gandhi, the vast canvas of Gandhi, a glimpse of Gandhi. It's very difficult to understand Gandhi. It's such a vast canvas. But whatever the esteemed panelists, they have given us the glimpses, that was very mesmerizing and very encouraging. So thank you very much.
In the end, I will take this opportunity to thank Professor Mukesh Ranjan and Registrar Mr. A.P. Siddiqui and the CIT, who has managed to, people from the CIT, Kazim and his group, which has managed to see that this program goes on without any problem, and it has been a very successful program. Thank you very much.